The air in the living room didn't smell like cinnamon or sugar cookies. It smelled of scorched pine and melting plastic, a sharp chemical tang that hung heavy in the silence. In the center of the room, amidst pristine white furniture and walls the color of heavy cream, stood the blackened skeleton of what had been a 12-foot designer Christmas tree. It was a jarring, ugly scar on an immaculate face. But the real story wasn't the fire itself or the ruin it left behind. The real story was in the two girls watching the smoke clear. There was 17-year-old Sophia, standing with her arms crossed and ash smudged on her cheek, her eyes burning with a defiance that masked a terrifying grief. She hadn't just burned a tree, she had tried to incinerate a lie that had been suffocating them for 3 years. And then there was 10-year-old Isabella, sitting quietly on the edge of the sofa, her small hands clasped tight around something hidden in her pocket. While her sister fought the fire with fire, Isabella was protecting the only truth that had survived the flames. To understand how they got here, to this moment of destruction, we have to go back to the silence before the spark. If you walked into the Miller household 2 weeks ago, you wouldn't have seen a home. You would have seen a stage set. It was a place where perfect wasn't just a goal, but a survival mechanism. The floors were polished to a mirror shine. The throw pillows were chopped and fluffed into submission, and emotions were curated just as carefully as the furniture. There was no room for mess, which meant there was no room for the heavy, jagged reality of their grief. It had been 3 years since their mother passed away, 3 years since the warmth seemed to drain out of the house along with her. In her absence, their father had constructed a new reality he called the new beginning. It was a phrase he used like a shield. He became obsessed with the idea that if the house looked perfect, if they looked perfect, then they would feel perfect. He believed that grief was a stain that could be scrubbed away if you just utilized enough bleach and expensive decor. The holiday season was the peak of this performance. The house was transformed into a winter wonderland of silver and ice blue crystal. It was breathtaking, cold, and entirely hollow. There were no mismatched stockings, no sentimental clutter, and absolutely no mention of the past. Their father orchestrated the season with the precision of a military campaign. The girls were expected to wear color-coordinated outfits for the annual Christmas card, velvet dresses that scratched and shoes that pinched, and smile on command. The mandate was clear: happy memories only. But happiness cannot be mandated, and grief, when suppressed, doesn't disappear, it ferments. Sophia was the visible glitch in this pristine system. At 17, she had no interest in playing the part of the dutiful daughter in her father's fantasy. She wore black combat boots with her velvet dress, a small but deliberate rebellion. She left heavy silences in conversations where laughter was expected, refusing to let him pave over the memory of their mother with platinum ribbons and store-bought joy. And then there was Isabella. At 10 years old, she had learned that the safest way to exist in a house constructed of glass was to be soft and quiet. She didn't fight like Sophia. She didn't scream or slam doors. Instead, she collected details. She noticed the way Sophia's hands trembled when their father talked about moving forward, and how his bright, toothy smile looked more like a grimace of pain he was terrified to acknowledge. Isabella understood something the adults seemed to miss. The house was a pressure cooker. The harder their father tried to seal the lid on their shared history, the more the pressure built. She could feel the vibrations of it in the floorboards. She watched Sophia's patience eroding, grain by grain, with every forced family tradition that felt like a betrayal of the one person who was missing. While Sophia prepared for war, Isabella prepared for survival. She became a collector of small truths, retreating to the safety of her bedroom while the tension downstairs tightened like a wire ready to snap. She knew that the new beginning was fragile, and she knew, with the instinctive wisdom of a child who has lost too much, that eventually the perfect facade would have to crack. The fracture in the household didn't happen all at once. It happened in a series of small, quiet renovations that eventually amounted to an earthquake. The specific wound that would eventually lead to the fire began 3 days before Christmas, with the arrival of several large, glossy boxes from a high-end interior design firm. For years, the Miller Christmas tree had been a chaotic, beautiful history book of their lives. It was a patchwork of memories that made no aesthetic sense, but made perfect emotional sense. There were macaroni stars painted in preschool, felt reindeer with missing eyes, and fragile glass baubles that they had bought on their first family vacation to the coast. It was messy, it was colorful, it was them. But this year, their father decided that the history book was too painful to read. He didn't just buy new decorations, he ordered a complete aesthetic overhaul. He replaced the warmth of the past with the precision of the new beginning. He unpacked boxes filled with heavy, expensive crystal orbs and silver finials. There were ribbons made of imported silk in shades of icy blue and platinum. It was the kind of decoration you see in a hotel lobby, impeccably tasteful, aggressively expensive, and completely devoid of a pulse. He called it a refresh. He told the girls that it was time to elevate their standards, to clear out the clutter that was holding them back. But Sophia, watching him hang a $60 crystal icicle where her favorite clay snowman used to be, heard what he was really saying. He was saying that their memories were tacky. He was saying that the evidence of their mother's hands, the things she had glued, painted, and hung with her own fingers, was just debris that needed to be swept away to make room for this sterile, shiny future. The fracture point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. While Sophia was the storm crashing against the cliffs of their father's denial, Isabella was the deep, still water beneath. At 10 years old, she had become fluent in the language of the unspoken. She navigated the house with a softness that bordered on invisibility, a survival trait she had developed as the emotional walls began to close in. She saw the tremors in Sophia's hands that their father chose to ignore. She heard the jagged edge in her sister's voice that signaled a breaking point was near. But while Sophia's grief was a loud, expanding thing that demanded to be seen, Isabella's was a quiet, hoarding thing. She understood that they were in danger, not of physical harm, but of a spiritual vanishing. The new beginning was a tide rising to wash away their footprints, and Isabella knew she had to build a raft. Her mission began in the hallway, where the casualties of the living room renovation had been piled. 3 large cardboard boxes sat by the door, destined for a charity pickup. Their father had labeled them Holiday Misc, a sterile, bureaucratic name for what was actually the physical evidence of their family's history. Sophia had stormed past these boxes earlier, kicking one in a fit of helpless rage before slamming her bedroom door. But Isabella didn't kick the boxes. She waited. She waited until the house was suspended in a fragile afternoon lull, her father on a conference call about import tariffs, Sophia drowned out by the thumping bass of her headphones. Only then did Isabella kneel on the cold hardwood floor, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She opened the flaps of the box marked fragile with surgical care. Inside, buried under a tangle of generic gold garland and discarded wrapping paper, she found what she was looking for. It was the lopsided angel. It was an ornament the 3 of them, Isabella, Sophia, and their mother, had made at the kitchen table 4 Christmases ago. By any objective standard, it was a disaster. It was made of salt dough that had been baked a little too long, resulting in a hue that was more burnt toast than celestial being. The paint was a chaotic mix of acrylics that had smeared before drying, and one wing was significantly larger than the other, giving the angel a permanent, drunken tilt. The halo was a pipe cleaner that had rusted slightly over the years. But when Isabella's small fingers closed around the rough, bumpy surface of the dough, she didn't feel a piece of trash. She felt a pulse. She could suddenly smell the kitchen from that day, the scent of flour and vanilla, the sound of the rain against the window, and the bright, ringing sound of her mother's laugh when the wing fell off the first time. "She's not broken," her mother had said, gluing it back on with exaggerated care. "She's just dancing." That ornament held the vibration of that laugh. It held the warmth of a mother's hand guiding a paintbrush. It held the imperfection that their father was currently trying to scrub out of existence. The cool, smooth glass of the new designer ornaments felt like ice. This lump of clay felt like life. Isabella didn't cry. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She had work to do. She slipped the lopsided angel into the deep pocket of her fleece pajama pants. It was heavy and awkward, a hard, jagged lump against her thigh, but it felt like an anchor. As long as she had this, the erasure wasn't complete. As long as this uneven, chipped little angel existed within the walls of the house, their father couldn't rewrite the entire story. She stood up and resealed the box, smoothing the tape so no one would know a rescue had taken place. It was a profound irony that in this house of noise, Sophia's slamming doors, their father's forced carols, the constant hum of anxiety, the youngest, quietest person was the only one doing the actual work of saving them. Sophia was fighting the lie with anger, and their father was fighting the grief with denial, but Isabella was simply saving the truth. She patted her pocket, feeling the sharp edge of the angel's wing, and walked back toward the living room. She was a 10-year-old smuggler, a guardian of the soul, carrying the weight of their history in a pair of fleece pajamas, waiting for the inevitable fire she knew was coming. The dining room table was set with the kind of precision usually reserved for surgical instruments. Under the cold glitter of the crystal chandelier, the scene looked less like a family dinner and more like a spread in a glossy magazine. The kind you flip past in a dentist's waiting room because it looks too expensive to be real. The tablecloth was a sheet of blinding white linen, starched so stiffly that it felt more like cardstock than fabric. In the center sat a floral arrangement of white roses and frosted pine cones, so large that it effectively built a wall between Sophia and her father, blocking their view of one another. The meal itself was a masterpiece of catering. Roast duck with a cherry reduction, truffle-infused mashed potatoes, and vegetables that had been steamed to a vibrant, unnatural green. It was delicious, technically speaking. It was also completely tasteless. To Sophia, every bite tasted like ash. It lacked the messy, chaotic warmth of the meals their mother used to burn and laugh over. There was no smell of overcooked onions, no splatter of gravy on the placemats. There was only the polite clink of silver against china, a sound that seems to echo too loudly in the high-ceilinged room. Their father was vibrating with a manic sort of energy, his eyes darting around the table as if checking off a mental list of requirements for the perfect night. He kept steering the conversation away from anything real, batting away silences with forced anecdotes about his golf game or the new client he had landed in Tokyo. He had instituted a rule before they sat down, spoken with a smile that was actually a warning. No sad faces tonight, girls. We're focusing on the positive. Isabella pushed a pea around her plate, building a small green fortress to hide behind. She wasn't eating. She was watching Sophia. She could see the tension in her sister's jaw, the way Sophia's knuckles were white where she gripped her fork. The air in the room felt thin, like there wasn't enough oxygen for all three of them, and the ghost they were pretending wasn't there. Then came the moment that shattered the glass house. Their father stood up, tapping a spoon against his wine glass. The sound was sharp, piercing the low hum of the jazz music playing softly in the background. He looked at his daughters, his face flushed with wine and the desperate, delusional hope that he had fixed them. "I just want to say," he began, his voice thick with emotion that felt misplaced, "how proud I am of us. Look at this house. Look at this dinner." He gestured vaguely to the room, to the expensive trap he had built. "We have had some hard years, I know that. But tonight proves that we made it through the tunnel. I look at us now and I don't see the broken pieces anymore. I see a family that is healed. I see a fresh start." He raised his glass higher, beaming at them. "To the best Christmas ever. To finally being whole again." The words hung in the air, grotesque and impossible. Finally whole again. It was the specific phrasing that did it. It wasn't just a lie. It was an erasure. By claiming they were whole, he was implying that the missing piece, their mother, was unnecessary. He was saying that the hole she left had been successfully filled with white roses and roast duck. Sophia didn't scream. She didn't throw her glass against the wall, though the urge rippled through her muscles. Instead, a terrifying calm settled over her. It was the clarity of absolute zero. She realized, in that heartbeat, that her father wasn't just grieving differently. He was actively rewriting their reality. And if she stayed at this table, if she smiled and drank the sparkling cider and agreed that they were whole, she would be an accomplice to the murder of her mother's memory. She stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor, a harsh dragging sound that made her father blink. "Sophia?" he asked, his smile faltering just a fraction. "We haven't had dessert yet. The tart is lemon, your favorite." "We aren't whole," Sophia said. Her voice was soft, almost conversational, which made it infinitely more frightening than a shout. "We are bleeding. You just put a velvet tablecloth over the wound." She turned away from the table, away from the white roses and the lie, and walked toward the living room. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was moving underwater. "Sophia, sit down!" Her father's voice rose, the commander trying to regain control of his troops. "Don't you dare ruin this night. I have worked too hard for this." She kept walking. She crossed the threshold into the living room, where the 12-foot designer tree stood glowing in the corner. It was a monolith of silver and blue, shimmering with thousands of dollars worth of glass and silk. It was beautiful. It was cold. It was the centerpiece of the new beginning. Sophia reached for the mantelpiece. Her hand closed around the long silver fireplace lighter. "You want a perfect Christmas?" she whispered to the empty room, though she knew they were watching from the doorway now. "You want a bright, shiny spectacle?" She flicked the safety off. The click was audible in the sudden silence. "Sophia, what are you doing?" Her father's voice cracked, panic finally piercing his denial. "I'm giving you the brightest one of all," she said. She didn't hesitate. She didn't tremble. She extended her arm and touched the flame to the bottom branch of the tree. The Douglas fir, dried out from weeks in the overheated house and draped in flammable silk ribbons, ignited instantly. The flame jumped from the lighter to the dry needles with a sound like a gasp. In seconds, the bottom tier was engulfed, the fire racing up the ribbons like a living thing, hungry and fast. The stench of scorching pine and chemical smoke hit them instantly, a sharp, toxic perfume that signaled the end of the masquerade. The perfect Christmas was truly burning. The fire didn't behave like a decoration. It behaved like a starving animal. It consumed the silk ribbons first, the flames racing up the height of the tree with a terrifying, crackling speed that defied physics. The new beginning turned into black ash in seconds. The expensive glass ornaments, those hand-blown, imported spheres of perfection, didn't just break. They exploded from the sudden intensity of the heat. Pop, pop, pop. They sounded like tiny gunshots in the living room, a violent applause for the end of the performance. Shards of silver and ice-blue glass rained down onto the white carpet, glittering dangerously in the orange glow of the inferno. The heat was a physical blow, a sudden tropical wave in the climate-controlled sterility of the house. It was a chemical chokehold that instantly replaced the scent of expensive vanilla candles. It was the smell of a mistake that could no longer be hidden. Their father broke his paralysis with a strangled cry. He didn't scream at Sophia. He didn't have the breath for it. He lunged for the heavy decorative blanket on the sofa, an imported cashmere throw that cost more than their first car, and began beating the flames with a frantic, terrifying desperation. He was fighting a monster he had fed for 3 years. When the blanket proved useless against the voracious silk and dry wood, he scrambled toward the kitchen, his dress shoes slipping on the polished floor, stripping him of all his usual grace. He returned seconds later with the red canister of the emergency fire extinguisher, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his face a mask of primal fear. Sophia didn't move. She stood by the fireplace, the lighter still loose in her hand, watching the destruction with a face that looked carved from stone. There was no glee in her expression, no manic triumph of the rebellious teenager. There was only a tragic, heavy satisfaction. She was watching the physical world finally align with the internal one. The house was now as shattered as they were. She watched the flames lick the ceiling, leaving black soot marks on the pristine crown molding, and she felt the first deep breath she had taken in months rattle in her chest. She was the arsonist of her own life, willing to burn down the shelter just to feel the cold air of truth. With a final, sputtering hiss of chemical foam, the fire died. The roar of the flames vanished, leaving a ringing silence that was somehow louder than the explosion had been. The smoke alarm, which had been shrieking, was silenced by a frantic jab from a broom handle, leaving only the sound of their father's ragged, wet breathing. The living room was a war zone. The designer tree was a charred, dripping skeleton, slumped over like a dying man in the corner. The white carpet was stained with soot, water, and chemical foam. The air was gray and thick, stinging the eyes. The perfect Christmas lay in ruins, destroyed in less than 3 minutes. Their father stood amidst the wreckage, his hands covered in soot, his expensive suit ruined. The adrenaline that had been propelling him seemed to evaporate, leaving him hollowed out. He looked at the blackened stump of the tree, and then at the walls he had tried so hard to keep white. He wasn't looking at a fire hazard. He was looking at the literal pile of ash his money had bought. He had tried to purchase happiness, to curate peace, and it had all burned down because it wasn't real. The realization seemed to physically shrink him. Sophia waited. She stood in the corner, bracing herself against the mantelpiece. She expected the explosion. She expected to be told to leave, to get out, to take her darkness somewhere else. She waited for the final rejection that would confirm she didn't belong in this new beginning. She watched her father's shoulders heave, waiting for the anger to turn toward her. But the shout didn't come, just the heavy, suffocating weight of a truth that could no longer be painted over. The room was dead silent, save for the dripping of water from the ruined tree onto the ruined floor. And then, in the corner of her eye, a small movement broke the stillness. Isabella stepped into the center of the ruined room, looking impossibly small against the blackened backdrop. She moved through the lingering smoke like a ghost, ignoring the charred skeleton of the tree and the shards of exploded crystal that littered the carpet. She walked directly to the coffee table, which was coated in a fine layer of gray soot, and reached deep into the pocket of her fleece pajama pants. She pulled out the lopsided angel. Against the devastation of the room, the ornament looked even more ridiculous than usual. But in a room where thousands of dollars of designer decor had just been reduced to ash, this ugly little piece of clay was whole. It was solid. It was the only spot of color in a world that had turned to monochrome gray. Isabella placed it gently in the center of the table. It sat there, a tiny, defiant beacon of red and green, the only ornament that wasn't on the tree, and therefore, the only one that had survived. The revelation hit Sophia and her father at the exact same moment. Sophia stared at the angel, her breath hitching as she realized her little sister had saved the one thing she thought was lost forever. But the impact on their father was catastrophic. He looked from the destroyed, expensive tree to the clumsy, surviving angel. The irony was absolute. The things he had called perfect were flammable and temporary. But the thing he had tried to discard as clutter? It was the only thing left standing. His knees hit the wet, ruined carpet with a heavy thud. He realized, with a force that knocked the wind out of him, that he had been protecting the glass and throwing away the diamond. If Isabella hadn't disobeyed him, if she hadn't rescued this piece of their mother's joy from the donation box, it would be gone too. Not burned, but erased by his own hand. He covered his face with his hands, and the sound that tore out of him wasn't the polite, repressed sadness he had allowed himself for 3 years. It was a raw, guttural sob. It was the sound of a dam crumbling. He wasn't crying over the burnt tree. He was crying because he finally understood that while he was trying to buy a new beginning, his daughters were just trying to hold on to the love he was throwing away. Sophia didn't move away. She watched her father fall apart, and for the first time, she didn't see a tyrant. She saw a man who was just as broken as she was. The anger that had fueled her fire began to drain away, replaced by a strange, aching relief. The perfect family was dead, burned to ash in the corner. But the real family, the messy, grieving, honest family, was finally in the room together. Isabella stood by the table, her hand resting near the angel. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She just stood there, the quiet anchor in the storm, watching as the artificial walls came down. She was the only one who had known how to save them. In any other version of this story, the next hour would have been spent cleaning. There would have been a frantic rush to sweep up the glass, to scour the soot from the carpet, to erase the evidence of the explosion. But not tonight. Tonight, the Miller family sat on the floor. They sat right in the middle of the wreckage, surrounded by the damp, blackened remains of the designer tree and the shards of expensive ornaments. They didn't speak for a long time. They just breathed the smoky air, which, for the first time in 3 years, felt breathable. Their father didn't banish Sophia to her room. He didn't lecture her about the cost of the curtains or the danger of the fire. Instead, he did something he hadn't done since the funeral. He pulled the white tablecloth off the dining table, dragging the expensive centerpiece with it, and spread it over the ruined carpet to create a picnic space amidst the debris. He brought the platter of cold duck and the bowl of potatoes down to the floor. They ate with their hands, tearing into the meat with a primal need that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with shedding the pretense of civility. The truffle oil mixed with the smell of ash, a strange, earthy combination that felt grounding. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough and quiet. He wasn't looking at the wall, he was looking at Sophia. "I thought if I made everything look new, we wouldn't hurt anymore. I thought I was fixing us, but I was just painting over the cracks. I wanted to erase the pain. Every time I saw an old ornament or a picture where she wasn't smiling perfectly, it felt like losing her again. So I tried to curate her. I tried to make her memory safe." Sophia looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the exhaustion behind the mask he'd been wearing. She reached out, her hand hesitant, and touched his arm. The soot on her fingers left a mark on his white shirt, but he didn't flinch. "We don't need to be fixed," she said, her voice trembling. "And Mom wasn't safe. She was loud. She burned cookies. She laughed until she snorted. That's who we miss, not the saint you're trying to invent." It was the first honest conversation they had shared in 1,000 days. The anger that had been poisoning the house began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile, tentative connection. Then Isabella spoke up. She picked up the lopsided angel from the coffee table, turning it over in her hands. "I knew the glass stuff wouldn't last," she said simply. "Glass breaks when you drop it. But this is made of mud and salt. It's tough. That's why I saved it." Her father stopped chewing. He looked at his 10-year-old daughter, realizing that while he was reading self-help books on grief, she had figured out the entire secret of survival on her own. Love isn't the shiny glass ornament that shatters at the first impact. It's the lopsided lump of clay that endures the heat. They woke up on the couches in the living room, having fallen asleep amidst the wreckage. The morning light that filtered through the smoky haze wasn't the stark, bright light of a showroom. It was soft, diffused, and forgiving. It highlighted the soot stains on their faces. For the first time, they didn't rush to change into matching pajamas. They sat in the mess, drinking coffee and hot chocolate. And when they were done, they didn't go out to buy a new tree. They simply took the lopsided angel and placed it on the center of the mantelpiece. It stood there, watching over a family that was slowly healing. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Sometimes, the structures we build to protect ourselves become the very things that suffocate us. Sometimes, you have to let the artificial perfection burn down so you can find the solid foundation underneath. As Isabella slept on the sofa that afternoon, the quiet guardian of their truth, she reminded us that love is not about flawless presentation, but about endurance. What truths are you protecting in your own life? Subscribe for more stories of resilience.